and welcome Norm Gold. So this is Michael Coved, and I'm carrying the speaker series, and this is one of a set of different events that we've been having with the club to keep everyone engaged and close to the club during the pandemic especially. And it's been really heartening to see the interest that our members are having in learning about different facets of cycling. And we've had grav rides, learn how to use GPS. We have adventure series, which was really the number one request. And in talking to Norm, I think we have a great speaker here. He's been on many trips, foreign travel and domestic travel. He has an emphasis on being able to do it oneself. And so he's going to share his experience in how to set up a successful adventure. And he's going to highlight one of his trips to New Zealand, the Kiwi there. So
he did a trip to New Zealand, he's going to talk about.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And so today, just for the record, today is November 19th, and it's about 7 o'clock. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Norm. One last thing. If you have questions, drop them into the chat box, and I'll moderate that. And if there's something that that's like right on point, I'll interrupt Norm. And otherwise, Norm will go back over the chat box at the end and just field all the questions that come up. Okay. So without further ado, Norm, it's all yours.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be a Grizzly and to be able to present to the Grizzly Peak Cyclist. This is a real thrill for me. As I think I told Michael, oh, by the way, Michael, are we recording now? Okay, so it's a real great opportunity for me to sort of relive my life as a cyclist and share some of the things that I'm very passionate about. So while I will talk about New Zealand, and you see the kiwi and the New Zealand fern on my first slide, I want to spend the first part of my presentation really talking about planning any bike adventure and how to get through all the things that you might need to make it a successful experience. Starting out with one of my favorite sayings, this African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it's been my experience that not only has cycling been great for my health and my physical and mental health, but it's also been something which has made it possible for me to build a community of like-minded folks and really share this with family and friends in ways that you just never get to do if you're one-on-one. And so we all try to work together when we're out riding individually for a day trip, but going on a bike adventure is something really special. It's not only something we've done with a group of comrades, of fellow cyclists, but we've built our relationship over many years by taking these trips. A few words about who I am. I'm 74 years young. I retired last year from my work as an educator, formerly in Sacramento based, where I worked with the California Department of Education. And then Gina and I moved here to Berkeley 8 years ago. I'm unabashedly proud of the fact that I'm a cyclist. And now at my age, I could say I'm somewhat of an athlete. I think anybody who can ride up Grizzly Peak and do some of the rides I've done is at least a bit of an athlete. I started serious cycling when I was in my mid-40s, even though I had been commuting to work 3 miles each way for many years and continued to do that for about 20 some years. But I started just serendipitously getting out into a serious ride when a friend of mine issued a challenge, and he said, let's ride from Davis to Napa, stay overnight and have dinner at a great restaurant and then come back. And I said, I've never done more than 15 miles in my life, but I'm up for it. Well, the ride almost killed me, and I loved it ever since. I've been hooked. It didn't kill me, obviously, but it was a great challenge without having trained very much. I'm a cycling advocate in addition to other things, and love being part of the Grizzly Peak Cyclists and Bike East Bay regionally and Cal Bike and the League of American Bicyclists. And because of the things I've done abroad and the study I've done and the work I've done, I speak Spanish pretty fluently for the last 50 years. Italian, some French, German, Portuguese, and I can read Catalan. Now, that language background wasn't particularly helpful in New Zealand, but it has been on other rides. So you know a little bit more about me, my preferred Grizzly Peak Cyclist pace and terrain. I do LT to T rides, some rides at the TM, and terrain levels 2, 3, or 4. And people who aren't with the Grizzlies can go on the Grizzly Peak Cyclist website and see a definition of these pace and terrain indicators. My adventures, I'm going to start just by making it clear that I'm talking about New Zealand today, but on this list, you'll just scan through. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I've been to Italy 4 times, Spain twice, France, done the Selkirk Loop up in northern US and into Canada, and other bike adventures. And I've been very fortunate to do that, mainly because of my spouse, who's been so supportive of my passion for cycling. And she understands how helpful it is for my mental and physical health. Now, this session, in my mind, was for people who cycle regularly and dream of an adventure trip. But up to now, you haven't been really sure about how to start planning, or you hesitate to pay for the costs of commercial trips, and you're not sure you can do this without a tour company. So I want to do a quick poll. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you're going to see a reactions button on the far right. It looks like what I have on this screen right now. And if you've ever gone on a bike adventure for 2 or more days, please click the thumbs button on the far right and let us see if you have in fact been out there. Now, some of you who have your video off, I guess I won't see that. So maybe you could just put a word in the chat, say yes, that's all you need to put in when you send the chat to everybody if you can't do the screen. And I'll get back to that in a minute.
And, you know, Norm, I am not seeing a reaction button on here. So I could, why don't we just use the chat just to keep it simple?
Okay, that's fine.
And so maybe a yes, no. So if you could phrase what the yes, no is, that would be.
Sure. Just if you've been on a bike adventure for 2 or more days, please say yes in the chat. That's all you have to do is type chat and have it chat to everyone, and we'll all see that. Other people who are eating dinner may not get to this, but I just wanted to get a sense of the group. I mean, I know that we now have 22 people on the call, so I want to get a sense of how many might have of this experience.
So far, I'm seeing all yeses so far.
And that's about how many, Mike?
Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So far, I'm counting about 17.
17 yeses. Okay.
Yeah. I got one no. I got one no.
Okay. So then if you've done that and you've been on your own multi-day trip, I'm going to race through much of the planning content, but I wanted to be able to give folks a sense of what goes into planning a successful bike adventure. What I'm covering in the next few slides are who, when, what, where, how, and I don't even need to cover the why. It's because I assume everybody on this call just absolutely loves being on your bike. I want to cover some aspects of self-supported versus commercial trips. I want to talk about transporting your bike by air, train, transfers to and from your first lodging, SAG car or no SAG, planning routes, logistics and credit card touring, costs of all kinds. And then for resources, I won't talk about those directly, but I've developed a multi-page list of websites, maps, books, and cycling groups, and some videos on YouTube that'll be very helpful to anybody who wants to do some planning of their next bike adventure after today.
Hey, Norm, I just want to interrupt, but for folks on the phone, particularly the folks who said they haven't been on a multi-day trip but are thinking about it, that we will put a link to your presentation. So out there, I don't know exactly where yet, either on the GPC site or on our YouTube, the club's YouTube channel. We'll make that available to everyone afterwards, so that, you know, don't worry, you'll get the content from this presentation.
Yeah, I will still cover it, but I'm not going to put as much emphasis on some of the planning things, since it seems like 17 out of 22 have done multi-day trips already themselves. But my initial intent was to work to help out those folks who may not have ever done that, and or they've done it with a commercial company and they're thinking about doing their own planning.
Sure.
So as we've already said, we'll do, I hope, keep it to 15 minutes Q&A at the end, and you put your questions in chat as we go along. You've already heard it's being recorded, so you can look at this later, and then I'll post slides and PDF of resources. So here are the essential details of what you need to decide and plan if you're going to do your own trip. Of course, you need to have your destination in mind and think about ideal dates based on people's availability and weather and political conditions on the ground in the country you're going to. I mean, there could be any number of issues, and your own personal needs. You want to choose your peloton or your team and assemble a group that you're going to travel with. Those two are really very early on in the planning cycle. You then are going to want to work out specific routes and lodging, meals. Not only your meals, are there restaurants anywhere near where you're going to be having to stay, but food and water along the way. Next is, what do you take with you? Now, I've done it both ways. I've traveled with only panniers, rear panniers. And I'll just tell you this anecdote. On my very first trip, we had one of the four of us took front and back panniers and thought he had to take the kitchen sink with him. And he rode all 3 weeks in Italy with all that stuff, including up some 18% grades. I couldn't believe it, and we encouraged him to send some stuff home or leave it behind, but he actually worked out quite a bit to do all that. But I would urge, if you're traveling with panniers, it's possible to do a good weather trip where you don't have rain or much rain with 18 pounds or less in your panniers. If you're going with a SAG car, you want a small rollerboard and maybe a day pack that you'd leave in the van or the car. But luggage is something to think about. And I've got a video, a YouTube, of a wonderful gal in Europe who's gives you a 14-minute real detailed look at not only what to pack, but how to pack. So that's something to look for if you've never done this before. And then, of course, you want to work out the travel to and from your destination. One of the keys to planning is to take your time. And now under the COVID, we've got plenty of time, way too much time. Most of the places we want to travel to, even here within the US, aren't real anxious to see a bunch of folks who aren't native to the area showing up and maybe riding through their towns or coming to look for food there. And certainly New Zealand is very, very apprehensive about any of us showing up on their shores. So we do have time, and that's good for us who need the time to plan. And depending on the adventure, I urge that you take 3 months to maybe a year or more, depending on where you're going and how long. you don't want to stress about the details at first. You can do that in the last 2 weeks before you take off, but start working methodically through it and put on your calendar some planning days and talk with potential teammates, people who you think would like to go to this destination, and go out and ride with them. Now, I say the 3 to 6 on a self-organized trip is an ideal number. We did Spain, Madrid to Barcelona with 3 of us. That was fabulous. We've done trips with 4 or 5. The last trip we did was last spring in Sicily, where we had 8. And I have to say that got a little cumbersome. And it's because you have to make arrangements for lodging and meals for a larger number. You get people whose pace is different. It's harder to coordinate and keep track of everything. And then you can't all fit everybody, even in an 8 or 9 person van that you might rent when you need to go in all together, along with their luggage and their bikes and helmets and gear. So a number of 3 to 6 is ideal, whether you're going all self-supported and riding with panniers or whether you have a SAGV wagon. So one of the things to do while you're in this planning period is to study those resources, including looking up the commercial tours. I'm unabashed about reading up what Backroads offers, because they do some careful planning and they've got a real history of doing that. And they reveal details about where they go and when, and their timing and their routes and the legs of their tours. But I've given you quite a few resources in the appendix that you can get after tonight, both maps and books and all the rest. And last is one of the keys that I found to planning is, while you're doing the planning, and this is one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much, is that you get to savor the flavors, the languages, the terrain, the colors and cultures of where you're headed. And to me, planning a trip isn't quite as much fun as doing the trip, but it sure can be a lot of fun. And I've learned a great deal about the destination and about cycling there by spending the time with my teammates doing this planning. Some of the topics to talk about with your team in advance, those who are interested in the ride before you settle on exactly who's going to go and all the details of the tour. Are you going to rent or take your bikes? What kind of pace do you want to be on? What are your priorities? Some people just want to hammer lots of miles, and that's fine for those who want to do it. And you could set up a trip that goes as many miles as possible every day. That's not me, I'm telling you right now. I'm an LT to T rider in the Grizzly terminology, and I like to smell the flowers and taste the gelato. So it's something about the priorities of those you're going to ride with are really important. What about your lodging? Are you going to stay in tents? Do you need camping gear? That's a whole different type of adventure travel. We've done travel with mostly taking our own bikes, flying them into Milan and riding right out of the airport was our very first trip. But we also rented bikes when we went to Sicily last year, and that worked out great. It really depends on what the options are at your destination. The lodging types, when I talk to you in a minute about costs of this kind of travel, I wanted to make sure you understand that the cost can be very, very inexpensive if you are willing to sleep in very clean, very adequate 2-star or 3-star places, maybe even a 1-star place, and skip all the fancy, elaborate hotels. Some of the luxurious places that Backroads go to are nice, but you're only getting a bed and you're gonna wake up the next day and get on your bike. So we've taken the attitude that we want a fairly simple but clean, quiet place, and we've arranged lodging that way. Now, in terms of a total length of a tour, if you're going to travel internationally, I recommend at least 2 weeks for an international trip. You got to account for time getting there, getting back. You have to pack up, you have to set up your bike on arrival, test it out, make sure you work out any kinks. If you've flown your bike over, you want to make sure it actually gets there. Well, my bike didn't get didn't get to us in Galicia, Spain 3 years ago. For 3 or 4 days, I think it went by way of Africa and the Middle East before it got back to Spain. You want to make sure you have some wiggle room in your schedule. And then if it's worth spending your time and effort going all the way across the sea to New Zealand, you want to have enough time to really enjoy the scenery, make allowance for the fact that you may have some rain days and all the rest. So you're going to want to talk with your team about daily distances. What are your preferred distances? What might be the maximum your group would want to ride, especially if you're riding with loaded panniers, and then plan for some rest time and rest days. Communications. On our first trips, we actually took two-way radios, these walkie-talkies. Then that was in 2000 and 2001 and all the rest. Then we realized that it's really safer to stay within visual contact as much as possible. And we wanted to do that. And that the walkie-talkies were a big annoyance and weren't that much of a help. And then of course, cell phones came along and they're ubiquitous now, and cell service is available in most places you'll ride. So we settled on cell phones. You want to also talk with your team about costs and accounting. I'll tell you right up front that we've had a wonderful agreement among some of the guys that I've been riding with, is that we share costs and we cut it just evenly. We have a group kitty that pays for all of our snacks and midday expenses. And we just split equally. When we've had somebody who's on a special diet, we make allowances. So we give them a break in cost or whatnot. But somebody takes on the accounting. So what do you want to take with you when you do your adventure travel? I like alliterations, so I've worked out a list of the 7 T's and the 3 S's. The T's are team, terrain, and weather-ready gear, tubes, tires, tools, training, and tenacity. All of those are essential to take with you and plan for. Your team, of course, is the most important. It's who are you going to be riding with and what are their roles going to be as you go through your trip. If you work out gear, what you wear, what your bike needs, and the bike itself, you want to make sure it's adequate and appropriate to your destination. And of course, we always take extra tubes and tube inflators. I should have put inflators on there, but it didn't have a T. So you got pumps, and just make sure if you're traveling abroad and you're flying, you don't take any CO2 cartridges with you. You've got to find them over there because TSA doesn't allow you to take that on board, even in checked luggage. Tools and the training, a comment about training. Training for a big tour where you're riding multiple days, if it's not something you've done here in town, you want to make sure you plan for both getting your head in the space of the multiple day ride, and you get physical and mental training for that. And tenacity is just the stick-to-itiveness that comes from many years of riding, is that you understand that you're going to have some challenges along the way, and that you're going to work through those just by being persistent, and your team is going to help you get through any challenges. Safety-wise, I think there's only a couple quick things I want to say about that, and that is the protocols for safety are important. And we've tried to lay out a protocol of nobody off the front, at least for very long, and nobody off the back. So we've divided up by pace. And if we have a large enough group, some of us slower guys might be back together in a pod of 2 or 3 and somebody faster in the front. And of course, some first aid equipment. And I've already mentioned SAG or not, and you've got to make plans for a SAG wagon or a vehicle. Spokes is the last S. On a long trip, you may not do this on your day rides here in town, but if you've got an unusual wheel that has out of the ordinary spokes that you wouldn't be able to find in a small town, it's always handy to have a couple extra spokes. So we put 2 or 3 in our seat tube and they're always available, and they don't rattle around if you wrap them right. It's just something to have, and they're always available. There are some spoke repair gizmos that you can take along if you want. I've already mentioned some of these, but team roles include somebody who's going to book the lodging, a detailed route planner, a map meister. Now some of these roles are shared, of course. The map meister just is the person who's holding the physical maps or is really willing to take that role. But it's usually the route planner and map meister might be the same person. On our trip, we've always have one or two people who are designated mechanics, and I've been fortunate to have some buddies who are just really, really good at it and are always available to help out whenever any mechanical problem shows up. Now, the role of funmeister is an interesting one. We've got, you'd think, well, we're all out there to have fun as we take a trip, but this has been an important role to have. Somebody who's on the lookout for the next meal, the next gelato in Italy, the next pub that we might stop at, or the next cultural event that might have found out about, that we're going to a town 2 nights from now. There's going to be a concert in a park that we might actually want to go to after we clean up and check in after dinner. We've also had a designated accountant on our trips, especially since it's so much better with a group of 3 to 6 to just have somebody taking care of this and have shared expenses and not be worried about who's going to pay for what when as we go through the trip. And then it's been great to have a record keeper. One of our guys, Howard and Dave both, who you'll see in a minute on this New Zealand trip, were both good about writing daily diaries. Howard would send an email back to a email list that included our friends and family back home, and we would have that as a permanent record of our travel. He would attach 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 photos from our day, and then when we got back, we'd have this record of the trip. Now, interpreter at the bottom is one that's been important in some of our trips, because in France, Italy, Spain, we've had some language challenges as we've wanted to go out into areas that are really relatively remote. As a matter of fact, in our Galicia, Spain trip, as we were riding around Santiago de Compostela, we ended up being on roads and in little villages where we were told by the locals they had never seen any group of foreign cyclists ever come through that town. And you know, they weren't likely to speak much English. So one of my buddies, Fred, and I speak fluent Spanish. He and I both speak some Italian. We've got some French in the group and some other languages. So it's something to plan for, although I believe that it's possible to do self-supported travel, even if you don't have the language and skills that we have. And I've put in the appendix some resources for folks who want to do a little bit of language development before they take a foreign trip. And both Duolingual and Babbel are great resources for doing that kind of thing. In addition, Rick Steves' materials can give you lots of good starter things for traveling entry-level skills in another language. Just a note about costs, food, lodging, and all the rest. Excluding flights and souvenirs, back roads will charge you $3,700 to $5,000 a person for 5 nights of lodging, 6 days of a trip. That's great, and they do an incredible job of providing support. But the kinds of trips that I'm talking about have never cost us more than $2,800 for 3 weeks of travel, about half of what 1 week will cost you on a high-end tour you can do in a 3-week adventure. Well, what about that adventure? I'm going to take a big, deep breath here for a second, because we're going to New Zealand. And here's our trip from February 2nd to 24th, 10 years ago. That's our group, starting from the left to Dan on the left. That's me holding the New Zealand flag. Dave the checkered shirt, and Howard. We were all friends from a number of years back. I think we had known each other for 15 or 20 years, and we had cycled in Sacramento where we all lived at the time. We had come up with this trip that we planned out starting a good year in advance. Howard did a lot of the initial planning in terms and lodging plans. We ended up getting a van that drove us, I think it was Dave's van, and drove us to SFO. We then flew from SFO to Christchurch, New Zealand, traveling about 22 hours, crossing the international date line. There were just 4 of us on that trip. Christchurch was our start, and we started by train to Arthur's Pass because we weren't up for doing just the 90-mile trip up the mountain as our first leg of the trip. And it turned out to be a good call. Overall, we rode about 800 miles with 30,000 feet of ascents to Dunedin on the southeast coast, and then took a bus back. I'll show you that in a minute. Some of the highlights of that trip were the friendly Kiwis, that is the New Zealanders themselves. And we also saw the shy Kiwis, that is the little bird that you see pictured all the time, but you have to go to special dark little museum or a hideaway place that they built on the West Coast. We found one where a few Kiwis are visible in very dim light because they are really nocturnal animals. Another highlight of riding in New Zealand, in addition to riding on the left, not on the right as we do in the States, is that these coastal 2-lane roads is the only road that goes along hundreds of kilometers of that West Coast. There's just one road. You really can't get lost. But not only is it just 2 lanes, it's got dozens, maybe scores of 1-lane bridges because it's such a wet area of the island. There are many, many streams that come down that side of of New Zealand, and forests and ferns and lush growth. And so all of these bridges end up being, for a cost saving measure, built as only 1 lane. You'll see pictures of those in a minute. We did get to Fox Glacier, which is one of the highlights of the west coast of the South Island. Saw numerous lakes, sheep, and deer ranches. And at the end of the trip, we got to see albatross, seals, and even penguins on a separate outing near Dunedin. We had 15 total days on the bike. 5 of those days had some rain, and one of our planned trip days was total rain out. But we actually rode in the rain some of those 5 days, so we were able to make our destinations. The tour calendar took us 3 days to set up our bikes, spin to the coast, and check out local bike shops. Most of the days were 40 to 60 miles a day. The longest day was 72 miles. And we planned for 4 base camps: Greymouth, Fox Glacier, Wanaka, and Dunedin, where we actually had the joy of riding without any luggage because we did not have a sag on this trip. So we were riding, as we say, naked. Just our water and power bars, and that was it. Now I'm going to try this and see if it works because I want you to see the overview. So hang on a sec. This will just take a second, and I need to back out of the stop share and share my screen again with Google Earth. Okay, and here is.
This is sort of, he showed us a little bit of this.
Can you see this now, folks?
Yeah.
We're in the Bay Area.
Yes.
And,
Yep.
And we took off from SFO, flew to LAX. I hope you can see it. Can you, Michael?
Yes. Yep. Yep. We're good.
Good. So from LAX, we flew to New Zealand. It's a god-awful trip because for people who love to be active, you fly across thousands of miles of ocean, you're sitting cooped up in a plane and you can't spin your bike or do anything else. So we walk up and down the aisles as much as possible. But here's our trip. And I think I got this. Let me see. I'm having a hard time moving it. Okay. So this is the South Island of New Zealand. I want you to see all of New Zealand for a second. The North Island has about 3/4 of the population of New Zealand, at 5 million people. South Island has only 1/4, so it's not as densely populated. There are only a couple of fairly large population centers, Christchurch and Dunedin on the eastern coast, and small towns throughout. We skipped the wine growing region at the north of the South Island, but we did have a chance to get to Christchurch. I'm having a hard time seeing my okay. Having a problem here with my cursor. Okay, we got it. Okay. So from Christchurch, there's a little out and back to this beautiful little spot in Littleton. Won't be able to show you much of that, but you'll see a picture in a minute. And then from there, we did take a train up to Arthur's Pass and up into the center in the mountain range, and eventually rode our bikes down to Greymouth on the western coast. That's all for Google Earth right now. And I want to share back to the PowerPoint. So upon arrival, we set up our bikes, toured a little bit in Christchurch, which unfortunately has had the year after we were there, had a great big earthquake that leveled a lot of the city. I'm not even sure if this beautiful modern place it survived. Then we did that out and back to Littleton, 30 miles. There's Dave looking out at that beautiful Littleton Lake, and somehow the colors in New Zealand just are extraordinary. We took that train up to Arthur's Pass on this little train. I think it's a Swiss or Austrian manufacturer that we were able to get our bikes on, but you have to plan for that in advance to make sure that the train will take you and your equipment. And we got up into the hills at the Arthur's Pass at elevation, and then we did a 36 miles down to Greymouth. Beautiful, beautiful countryside with a beautiful rata flower, red flowers blooming all along in stripes along the sides of these mountains. And that's our group, Dave on the left, Howard, and then me. And a bit of apology for all you Cal folks here. Dave and I have UCLA roots, and so we were wearing our Bruin colors as we took this trip, and wanted to be positive about California. We did a 54-mile out and back to Pancake Rocks, which is just incredible road because it just is right on the edge of the shore. Views along the coast. And I'd like to direct your attention to the bottom of the screen where Map My Ride gives you elevations. You'll see that there's some downgrades in the early part of the trip, actually some 7 and 8% increase grades in the early part of the trip, but down at 13 and 14s. Well, those 13s and 14s ended up being what we had to climb back up as we went back to Greymouth. Beautiful view of the sea. We were right along the edge of the shore most of the day. One thing about food in New Zealand, it's actually quite good. This was an unusual dish called peas pie pud. It's cooked peas with a meat pie, a mountain of mashed potatoes and and gravy. And Dave reports that it was absolutely excellent, and it's all the carbs that any cyclist would ever need. South of Greymouth, we went to Hokitika and Hari Hari, little towns. Some are just villages along that western shore. And then came upon a surprise that taught us something about the US of A. A Carnegie Library. Now this is over 100 years old, but we found out when we did this trip that Carnegie Foundation, Andrew Carnegie of the States, right? made all of his money, I think, in steel and coal and all kinds of stuff, donated money for over 2,500 libraries around the world, most in the States, but many abroad. And 18 of them were built in New Zealand from 1908 to 1916. And the only thing he asked was that the locals commit to a perpetual maintenance, of course, stocking and staffing of these libraries, and perpetual maintenance, which 18 were done in New Zealand. Quite fascinating story. After Hokitika, we took a day of travel down to Lake Matheson and Fox Glacier, and took some of that time to walk through the incredible fern forests at that part of the island. Lake Matheson, looking back to the east, has some views of the Alps of south of the island, which include Mount Cook as the highest peak in New Zealand at over 11,000 feet. And I'm not sure if it's visible through this fog in one of these pictures, but Mount Cook is an amazing 11,000 foot ascent, which nobody's biking up, I'm telling you, that is within just a short distance from the West Coast. We did, however, hike to the front of the toe of Fox Glacier, which you can see in this picture, and we passed through spectacular ferns and forest on a challenging trail to get there. Now we were back on the road the next day on the 2-lane Route 6, which is the major highway along the Western Shore. It becomes a 1-lane bridge, as you can see here, but there were dozens of these as we went through our trip. Roads were pretty busy. You see all the cars? I'm telling you, it was just like that most of our trip. They weren't actually busy at all, except in locations near the towns and near Christchurch and Dunedin. But we saw many, many hours of empty open roads, which was delightful as a cyclist because, as you can see, there are no shoulders on most of these roads. And we're riding on the left, which took a little time getting used to. As I indicated, rain gear was needed for about 5 days, at least some of those 5 days. And here's Howard with his rain gear and his panniers all buttoned up. We had showers, but no steady, heavy downpour that we had to ride through. Here's one example of a stream coming off the mountains and in waterfalls, more 1-lane bridges that it looks like on the left that it's a stripe down the middle of the road as a 2-laner, but no, that's just the light coming through the side of the bridge. It's a 1-lane bridge that went on for several hundred yards as we crossed this large stream or river going into the ocean. From Haas to Makaroa along that southern part of the Western Shore, we had some tough climbs many times along the ride. And this is just a clip out of Map My Ride that show you in this few miles from, I think in 6 or 7 miles, we hit 9, 10, 11, and 14% pitches. But this is one of the things that I'm showing you now, not only to give you an idea of the ride, but this is something we can all do as we plan our next bike adventure by going to Map My Ride and some of the other resources and checking out the pitches of where we think would be a good route. And let's see if it's what we have in mind. Oh, one more waterfall? Sure, they're all over the place, and more 1-way bridges. We then took from Makaroa to Wanaka, 39 miles, beautiful mountains. And you can see how this one little bit of the trip I've shown you here on this map went right along a couple of lakes, and they were just beautiful. And Wanaka ended up being a place that we had planned to stay for 4 nights, and we're sure glad we did. On the road to Wanaka, the guys passed through Lake Hawea, gorgeous lake. And as you can see, it's not just because we didn't take pictures of the towns and cities around that lake. There's hardly anything there. It's just a beautiful, pristine part of New Zealand and beautiful scenes. This is Howard at Lake Wanaka, which is the other lake I showed you on that map. When we got to Wanaka and checked in, we decided, and basically this was Howard's idea because he always wants to go up to the highest paved point in any country we tour in. So this happened to be the climb that we had to take. It was 25 miles out and then we coasted back, but it was not only was it a steady climb for 25 miles, you can see at the very end at the bottom of the screen, we had 9, 10, 12, 15% pitches at the very end of the climb up to the highest point, paved point. And it was only sealed or paved in the New Zealand terms just in the 1960s. So this was just a gravel road or a dirt road up until that point, as were most of the roads on the western shore of the South Island. They only were sealed in the 1950s and 60s. One of the discoveries about New Zealand, and especially the South Island, was that it doesn't have the history that many of the places have that we've ridden around of hundreds of years of settlement and development. It kind of looks like maybe California did in the 1950s. It doesn't have such a long history as places that we've cycled in Europe, of course. Yeah, there are sheep in New Zealand. We saw them everywhere. We also saw deer farms with hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of deer in pens. And of course, the fences for the deer farms had to be much higher than the ones you see here for the sheep. But they cultivate lots of venison for shipment to Europe, especially. We even were surprised to find this old town of Cromwell that we zipped through, which is really maintained as it may have looked in the late 19th or early 20th century, and was quite a surprise to us. One of our delights was to find the town of Lawrence, which is a very, very small town, a few hundred permanent residents, but they had the two best eating places we had in the entire trip. And we'll recommend those to you anytime. Gabrielle's, which was a bank, and that bank corner was made into the restaurant itself. And then just a block away was the lemon tree that had this wonderful breakfast place. Our last stop was Dunedin, and you can see more sheep urging us on to that last stop. We got to Dunedin, which is a pretty large city, has a university and a museum and other things that we visited. Lots of bike infrastructure you can see here on the right, and some early 20th century architecture, a very interesting train station, and some other things to see. And then our big treat at the end of the trip was to take a 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. trip out to see the albatross, seals, and penguins from Dunedin here at the left, out to see incredible sight of the albatross soaring above us. And then we hiked down to the shore and saw penguins of a couple of varieties and a number of seals on the shore. So, discoveries. The fauna in New Zealand, there were no land mammals until the Europeans showed up in, really Captain Cook showed up in 1769, but really until the 19th century when lots of mammals were brought in by European settlers. There was a huge bird before the Maoris got there, a moa, which was 12 feet tall and weighed over 500 pounds. But the Maoris pretty much said, this is pretty tasty for dinner, and they ate most of them. As I said, I mentioned the libraries by Carnegie. Some of the travelers we met said New Zealand does have againsterlies. That is, we're always worried about westerly winds, and some people worry about the southerly winds. In New Zealand, you can always expect a headwind from somewhere. And so we adopted their term of calling them the againsterlies. I've already mentioned some of the food, seafood, wines, beet pies, dessert pies, also Thai, Vietnamese, Chinese, a lot of other Asian food, and even some roadkill sandwiches that the place on the Western Shore called them: boar, possum, venison, and a few other things. And of course, you've seen these green lip mussels here in the States. Well, they're about 2 or 3 times the size in New Zealand itself. They sell them that I would estimate they could be 5 to 6 inches in length. Enormous, fresh, and delicious.
Excuse me, hey, Norm, this is Michael. It's 7:50 right now, and we have a few questions, and so
okay. I'm wrapping up in 1 minute.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So recommendations. We all were in the mode of riding on very thin tires back there 10 years ago, 19, 21 millimeter tires at 110 pounds per square inch. But we recommend riding wider tires at lower inflation. Most of the roads in New Zealand that you'll ride on are chip seal, fairly rough. Recommendations, you can see them there on the screen. You'll be able to look at them later. And now we're time for questions. So
perfect timing. Do you want to take a look at the chat box? Do you want me to read some of them to you?
Why don't you just read them out, and I'll go off the PowerPoint now.
Okay. So how did you find or arrange for boxes to put your bikes in? I think we saw some bike boxes, like official bike boxes.
Yeah. So all four of us own our own bike boxes. I have a corrugated plastic one. It's just like a corrugated carbon carton, but it's corrugated plastic. I know Grizzly Peak Cyclist has one or two that they loan out. Bravo for Grizzlies. But I have a box which I'm glad to lend to somebody who wants to take a trip, because I don't use it that much, and other people do. On some of our trips, our first trips, we just got cardboard boxes from the cycle companies, from bike shops, put our bikes into those boxes, threw them away at the Milan airport, and we got back. After 3 weeks of touring Italy, we got bikes from the airline and shipped them back home. But now we each own our own boxes.
Okay, there's another question. I think I know the answer because you spoke about it, but since someone asked, did you feel safe on the 2-lane roads? Was there enough room for the bikes and traffic?
Sure. It's all relative. The Kiwis in general are very, very respectful of bikes. They are great outdoors people. The men and the women are always talking about bike rides and hikes and travel and canoeing and boating and all this stuff. And they're quite used to seeing bikes out there. But there are some foreign tourists who are driving RVs who weren't always as careful. And we got some no threats and no collisions, but they came a little close sometimes. But overall, very safe. And we all wore some bright clothing and had lights and stuff like that.
Well, that's good. We have another question. Did you travel with bike locks because they're heavy?
Yeah. So on our trips, we've each carried a very thin nuisance avoiding chain lock. Or just a cable lock with a small lock. And what that does is it gives us a feeling of security that somebody would take at least a few minutes to get through it. But on the New Zealand trip, we really didn't make use of them because we weren't leaving our bikes anywhere we couldn't watch them, possibly outside of a bar or restaurant, but we'd have them within sight. And I have to tell you, in all the trips I've taken, nobody's stolen a single bike. Even in France and Italy, where we left our bikes out of our sight for a short period of time to get a meal or something. It's always prudent to carry those little locks.
Okay. There's a question about food, and someone asked, how would a vegan fare in New Zealand? Were there vegan options?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Vegans will get a whole bunch of things, especially in some of the Asian food places. But also, there's grains, there's oatmeals for breakfast, there's stuff like that. It's going to be more difficult possibly than here, because now in California, you can get vegetarian and vegan meals almost anywhere. But even in Europe in our last Spain trip, one of our guys was pretty much vegetarian 3 years ago, and he was able to do just fine. Okay. So I would think you could, but you probably want to go online and check some menus before you set off to New Zealand if you are a strict vegan.
Okay. There's a question here. I think I'm going to hold this question, Carol, about group rides and train travel. Now I broached it. I'll bring it up. Carol says that she would like to use the train for travel, safe travel, and she, didn't know if other people in Alameda or others are, doing group rides. So that may be a question, we could put out more in GPC Talk. You may have a point of view, Norm.
Well, there aren't many trains in the South Island of New Zealand. So in talking about New Zealand,
I think she was implying
talking about here in California. I think we ought to put that out to Grizzlies in general. But I've done trains both here from Berkeley to Sacramento. We've done trains in Italy many times. We've done trains in France. Great success, but you do need to plan in advance and have some good luck about that.
Yeah. One question here about Bike Box. So where would you keep, or would hotels be good with their holding on to your Bike Box if you were to move around a little bit,
Oh yeah, absolutely. So every place we've negotiated, our start and end trips, whether it was in Paris, whether it was in Milan at a later time, whether it was in Spain, at Santiago de Compostela, or in Christchurch, New Zealand, we negotiated with a hotel to hold our boxes for the entire 3 weeks of our trip, and then came back and boxed things up and took off.
Excellent.
And most hotels have been willing to do that, and I have to say, in Naples, even when this was in the middle or toward the end of a trip in southern Italy, we were nervous about putting our bikes anywhere because, frankly, of all the places in Italy, that's the least secure place, or one of the places that I feel least secure, just because of the dynamics of the city. The proprietor said, "Oh, I've got an unused hotel room. Your bikes will be fine. They'll sleep better than anybody tonight." So he gave us a hotel room. And in France and in Spain, we had bikes stored in wine cellars. We had bikes put in very safe places by proprietors. It was wonderful.
Okay, terrific. So I think that we're just at the top of the hour here. And I think if folks have questions, Norm, is there an email address that people could send you questions?
You bet. I'd be glad to chat, email, or calls, and I'll put it up on the screen now. And
great.
It's something I'm glad to do. And I really appreciate the chance to share this with folks. And I'll try to look at the chat stream if you can stay on a minute, because it'll disappear on me if you don't, Michael.
Okay.
Okay. Let me just share this.
All right, and folks, I just put out a while Norm is cutting and pasting that screen, or putting that, making that available, a link to a post-event survey, and we just to take, if there are 3 questions, and if you could please respond to those questions, that helps us get some feedback about the event. And
so
there,
you see my last slide here now on the screen?
Yep. All right.
Okay.
Terrific.
Really, thank you for bearing with all the slides. I know it was a lot of material to present in the hour, but I wanted to share the notions about both thinking about doing your own adventure and thinking through the steps you need to do. And I'd be glad to share either individually or sometime in the future as a group other trips.
Well, Norm, thank you so much on behalf of the club and all the participants. I mean, you put so much great energy into this. and your experience really shows. You know, this wasn't a one and done. There's something you've done quite a bit, and so we're fortunate to have your experience you made available to us. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad to do it. Thank you. I look forward to riding with folks soon.
Yeah. And thank you for everyone who made the time to join us today. Thank you very much. See you at the next, we're next on December 17th, or December 7th. So please join us on December 7th for our next speaker. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.